Great. Good evening, everyone. On behalf of the Royal Society, I'd like to welcome you here to our Forensics Late evening. We're really delighted to see so many of you here. I'm really delighted to have this fantastic panel. Just a couple of housekeeping things. There are no fire alarms planned tonight, so if one does go off, please make your way to the exit to your left or the exit at the back. And please remember to turn off your phones as well, obviously. And we are also taking questions online and in the room tonight, so please use the Slido code that's there on the slides and enjoy the talk. Thank you.
Good evening. Welcome to this evening's event, which is called Staying True to the Crime, where we're going to deep dive into the world of fact versus fiction when it comes to the science in our crime fiction, be that in novels, on TV and film, or even indeed in podcasts, which is a massively growing media at the moment. Let me introduce us all. First of all, I'm chairing tonight's session. My name's Pennie Stuart. My background is as an audio producer and presenter specialising in science programmes. I presented the long-running BBC documentary series Brainwaves, and I work in partnership with the Leverhulme Research Centre for Forensic Science to produce and present their true crime podcast, Inside Forensic Science, where we take a historic case and retell it through the forensic science. Professor Niamh Nic Daeid, in the middle there, is director of the award-winning Leverhulme Research Centre for Forensic Science, where the 10-year mission is to provide a robust underpinning for the scientific evidence presented in our courts. She's a chartered chemist and an authorised forensic chemist with specialisms including fire investigation, clandestine drug chemistry and explosives. She also undertakes forensic casework, primarily in fire scene investigation, and has appeared as an expert witness for the courts. Dubbed the Queen of Crime, Val McDermid, on my right here, has sold over 17 million books to date across the globe and is translated into more than 40 languages. She's perhaps best known for her Wire in the Blood series, featuring clinical psychologist Dr. Tony Hill and DCI Carol Jordan, which was adapted for television, starring Robson Green and Hermione Norris. She's written 3 other series: Private Detective Kate Brannigan, journalist Lindsay Gordon, and most recently Cold Case Detective Karen Pirie, whose debut appearance in The Distant Echo is soon to become a major ITV series. And finally, we have Amelia Bullmore, graduated from Manchester University Drama Department in 1986 and has been working as a writer and actor ever since. If you look Amelia up on Wikipedia, you will discover an insane number of credits. So I'll give you the Reader's Digest version of her TV credits, which includes Traces, which she co-created with Val, Scott and Bailey, Attachments, This Life. Theatre writing includes Mammals, Dive and Viv and Rose, Ghosts, and there's radio writing in there as well, which includes Craven, County Lines, The Batman, and so it goes on and on and on, and that's not even got to her acting work. So an amazingly talented panel we've got in front of you. Please put your hands together and give them a welcome. Now, just to explain how it's going to work, there will be questions and answers from you, I hope, but what we're going to do is get the conversation very much rolling first of all and probably keep some of the questions for a bit later on. If you're bursting to jump in on something that we're in the middle of discussing, just give me a wave. If you're doing it online, pop the question there and we will get to as many of you as we can. Just so you know, at the end, we'll wrap things up, and then if you can stay where you are, I've got to hurtle full pace down the middle of here and get the sleeper back to Inverness. Really. So if you can stay in your seats so I could do a really sharp exit, I'd really appreciate it, because I have to get a train at 9:15, so that would be grand. So, without further ado, let's get going. Niamh, let's get this rolling, I think, with you. Why should we care about how much crime fiction stays true to the science of forensic investigation? Outline for us why this actually matters at all.
I think, firstly, welcome everybody. I think it's a really pertinent, really important question. And that's because the genre of crime fiction in particular is so popular, and it's one that reaches such a huge audience through fantastic writers like Val, and also where you see it on television and in movies and so on. So it has a real resonance with you, the public. because you're absorbing that information. So when I stand up in a courtroom to give evidence, when you sit in the jury or are in the jury, you have an expectation of what I'm going to deliver to you. And if that expectation has me here and what I deliver is here, then there's a challenge. Because crime fiction is, as I said, a fantastic genre, but if the science is portrayed in it as something that has a wow factor, or something that can be done in 10 minutes and deliver a result, or something that delivers a result out of necessarily the context of the case, then I'm never going to meet your expectation. And that could become, not saying that it does, but it could become a challenge to me as an expert witness dealing in the real world with real casework, trying to enable you to use the testing and the science that I've used in the case to help you reach a decision, because that's our job. We're not, we're independent tools, if you like, of the courtroom to try to help explain to you how science has explained the context of a finding within a case. And so if we don't get it right in our fiction, then we're setting up that challenge. We work a lot, many of us who are expert witnesses work a lot with writers such as these fantastic women beside me, who come and have dialogues with us and true conversations, and we explain, well, these are the limitations of this bit and this is the limitation of that bit. And you know, you use our science very carefully, for which we are very grateful, because of this issue, that in the real world, when it comes into the real world, it's really important that we're able to get it right for the sake of justice.
I think it's worth coming back in a little bit to talk about which areas of science maybe fall foul of this, the most, or some of the key things, particularly in forensic science, which cause you the biggest headaches maybe in that field. But Val, from your perspective, I know that you have lots of dialogue about the science in your work, but where does that sort of stem from for you? How do you feel about getting it right? Why does it matter so much for you?
Well, I think everybody understands that crimes are not solved the way we write about them in crime fiction. It's not Detective Inspector Grumpy and his sidekick single-handedly solving the murder. It's a lot of quite tedious and repetitive tasks. So when I'm telling a story, it's important to me to ground it in as many ways as I can. One of the ways I do this is with a sense of place, but one of the key ways I do this is with the authenticity when I'm writing about forensic science. For me, I suppose it's kind of lucky. The very first case involving DNA was 1986 in a courtroom, and my first novel was published in 1987. So I feel like my writing career has gone in lockstep with forensics. And very early on, I realized that this could be a very useful tool for me in ways to develop the stories I was telling. That if I knew what I was talking about, then I could make the science work for me in terms of the storytelling and the plotting. And so I decided to make forensic scientists my friends.
Has your relationship with it changed then and evolved? I mean, were you as conscious of it right from the beginning? Has it always been part of what you're trying to do with your writing?
Well, I was conscious of it to the extent that it was available at that point. There wasn't. It was quite basic. I mean, there were sort of fingerprints, and there were, the sort of Lockhart sort of principle of every contact leaves a trace. But until DNA and then other scientific fields developed in recent years, there wasn't that much to be aware of. But because quite early on in my career, I had got to know Sue Black, the eminent forensic anthropologist, I had a kind of foot in the door. And Sue would tell me things. Usually I'd ring her up and ask her one question, and in the course of a long conversation, she'd tell me 5 other things I could use, if not in that book, then somewhere down the line. And if she didn't know the answer to the question, she would pass me on to someone who did, a bit like a parcel. Here's Val, answer a question. And so that's how I know Niamh, and I ended up writing a book about forensic science for the Wellcome Trust, because they were reopening their gallery, and they were doing an exhibition about forensic science, and they wanted a book to accompany it, not a catalogue of the exhibition, but a book that examined the areas of forensic science that they were doing in the exhibition. And so I agreed to do it if I could do it on the basis of interviewing practitioners, which I thought, this gives me lots of more strings to my bow. So utterly cynical.
So science is obviously, I mean, it's a useful tool as a story device. I mean, for you, Amelia, to what extent do you actually feel a responsibility to that science as well as it being a useful device?
Well, I really did, because that book that Val just mentioned that accompanied the exhibition at the Wellcome was picked up by Red Production Company because it was so packed with fascinating stuff, and they thought, is there a drama in here? Well, as Val said, it was a series of conversations with forensic scientists. So Val came up with an idea which combined some of those fields of science, of forensic science, and then thought, okay, Great Precinct would be somewhere a bit like Cahill, where at the time Niamh and Sue Black were working. So that's a centre of teaching, and you've got students, you've got science happening there. They're working with the police, they're working with the court. So it's an amazingly rich place to put the story. And so when Val asked me if I would write it, she entrusted me with these relationships she had with Sue and Niamh to say, talk to them, see if you can talk to them, see if they're happy to work with you. And they were doing it because they wanted, they had a commitment to the correct portrayal of science. So I had to honour that undertaking. They weren't going to talk to me if I was going to play fast and loose with it. So I did feel really responsible, and it was complicated because, of course, in Val is in control of what she does with that information because she puts it in a book. That's just Val. But with TV, you've got so many other pressures on you to deliver shocks, twists, ramp it up. Could the explosion be bigger? Could that happen quicker? And so you have got a lot of things you need to marry, and you've got a lot of skilled people. So when Niamh tells me how an explosion works or what a burnt out toaster would look like, or how it could be rigged to cause a fire, that's got to go into the script. That prop has got to be made. That scene has got to happen convincingly. The people who talk about it, the fictional forensic scientists who've never said any of that before, they have to sound like they say that all the time. So there are so many slips between cup and lip, actually, because it's a hugely collaborative process, and some of the needs are at odds with some of the other needs. So the need to have the science be impeccably true is at odds with the appetite for thrills and spills, because sometimes what scientists are doing is the same thing doggedly again and again and again, and TV kind of grows on growth. Can it be more? Can it get worse? Can we have another body? So I did feel really responsible, and sometimes a bit hamstrung about how to deliver it.
Yeah, and I think that's a very difficult juggle. Niamh and myself were just talking about this afternoon, because there was a situation a little while ago where I said to Niamh, commissioning editor, been talking to, but can we come up with something where we can solve a historic crime? And she said, just doesn't work that way. I said, I know, but that was literally what the commissioning editor was saying to us, was it'd be great if you could give us something where we solve it.
Yeah.
And so it's a pressure.
But when we first started talking about traces, I was adamant that we had to go with the reality of the science, because it was important. I get so fed up, I mean, you get much worse for you guys who actually do it, of watching television programs where ridiculous forensic science is presented. And, you know, even I, as a lay person, who is really only just there as a curious lay person, I just go, that just couldn't happen. That's not how the science works. And I got so fed up with this over the years, and I got fed up with Sue and Niamh bending my ears about what was on the television over the years. And that was really the starting point. And that was that there are more than enough wow moments in real forensic science without having to make it up and without having to corrupt the truth. So that was where we started off, and I knew that Amelia would do this in the most meticulous and careful way possible, much more so than me.
So Niamh, what are some of the things that are most commonly miscommunicated? I'm trying to put it in the most polite terms I can.
I think I would kind of classify them rather than particular evidence types, although there are errors made in various types, but more in the way in which the evidence is portrayed. One is that we only ever take one sample, and we only ever analyse one sample, and you'll always get the right result out of that sample. So that's not true, and doesn't happen. Sorry. So that's one. Is that we're very meticulous in how we do things. We do a lot of validation of our work, and we do a lot of repetitive analysis where we're able to, because sometimes we're not able to. And the second is how fast it happens. So you don't get an answer coming from the machine about 2 seconds after you've introduced the sample to the machine. So that doesn't happen either. And that answer isn't always, the right answer that then identifies an individual. And so now I understand it's, that's the genre we're dealing with, and it's television or the movies or whatever it is, and its job is to entertain you. But it's also, I think, setting aside an aspect of just how rapid this kind of work is, and that's just not reality. So there's things about speed and about sort of repetitiveness, as you mentioned, Val. And then the other is about how we interpret things, because part of really being a forensic scientist is not so much about doing the analysis. Yes, that's really important, but it's also about interpreting the data we get from the analysis within the context of the case. And I'll give you an example. If we get a DNA profile, let's say in a murder case, and if that murder happens in somebody's house, and the DNA profile that becomes pertinent or important is that of one of the people that live in the house, so their DNA was on the knife, or their fingerprints, let's say, were on the knife, that is known to have resulted in the death of an individual. Fantastic evidence, but what does it mean? In the context of that person living in that house, it means nothing. If that person didn't live in the house, well, then it might mean something. So it's the same evidence, but the context changes. And so our job is about putting that evidence in context so that we can give the best interpretation of its value to the courtroom. So that sounds straightforward, but when we don't understand things about how, or we have little understanding, things like how DNA transfers from person to material and material to person. So you saw me, some of you, when you come in, I was filling up people's glasses. So I've handled that bottle. The person who put the bottle on the table also handled the bottle. So there is a chance that their DNA is now on my hand and is now on the glass that I filled up for Amelia. So my DNA might be on Amelia's hand. And we don't know the proper sequence of that transfer. So if you go home tonight and pick up a knife and stab somebody, not saying that you would do such a thing, pick up a knife and stab somebody, my DNA could be on that knife. And that's the kind of information in the real world that we have to do the research in to understand. You don't see that on the television. Actually, I think if you did see that on the television, it might be quite an interesting thing to start to make you think. But it's very complicated sometimes, the way in which we have to interpret the meaning of a trace in context. And then the final thing, sorry, I know I'm wittering on. The final thing is that we see much more now forensic science at the crime scene. So that doesn't mean people in white suits and gloved up. That's the way we protect ourselves in this country, and we protect the scene from us. But we see much more actual scientists at the scene working out the best places to take samples from, so that you don't just take everything. You actually bring the science to the crime scene rather than just gather everything and then head off to the laboratory.
Now, I've got masses of questions here, but I'm already getting some really nice questions in, so I think I'll turn to some of those straight away. Jim, excuse the pronunciation, Harker, says to the whole panel, is there one thing in forensics that you see depicted wrong in fiction all the time that really annoys you? I know he's going to be most annoyed. It's probably Niamh, but maybe. Is there one thing that's depicted that most irritates you?
I can start. Mm-hmm. If you like, let me get my list out. I think the thing that most annoys me in terms of the depiction is a little bit of what I've just said, and that is that we always find the smoking gun. We always find the fingerprint, and we always link the fingerprint to the person. And that isn't the way it happens in the real world. It's much harder than that. It's much more complicated than that. And so I think this idea that science brings certainty is the thing that irritates me, because science is about uncertainty, not about certainty. So I think that's an area that is often depicted incorrectly.
Any thoughts, Amelia?
There are things I noticed that I never would have noticed before I worked on Traces, and a lot of it is language, and sometimes you're never going to swap what's now accepted for what should be the right thing, because the thing that's accepted is just too prevalent. So somebody will say, there's a DNA match, and actually that's not what you say, or it doesn't quite describe what's happening, but that's understood to be how you say it. Whereas in fact it's something along the lines of the DNA, like it's consistent with, or it doesn't, how do you say it properly?
I wouldn't say DNA match.
No, exactly, exactly.
I think it's much more complicated there, because you have to give an idea of the chance or the likelihood of that DNA matching somebody, more than one person,
so you've got
basically.
a very long lumpy sentence versus a very quick snappy sexy sentence, and unfortunately the short one's going to win. So I really notice the shortcuts, and I notice that there are maybe 3 people when there would have been 10. I understand that's about a budget thing, so there are some compressions I just get that make sense, but I do see big differences between what I know goes on from working with Val and her colleagues, and even her colleagues, and what I see on the telly.
I think what does my head in particular is digital forensics. When they find a laptop or they find a phone, and it's password protected, and then the next scene they've cracked it. The reality is that sometimes it can take months for the digital forensics team to get into a laptop or a phone. And so the notion that suddenly everything changes because they've found a laptop or they've got somebody's phone.
That I can forgive, because what are they supposed to do? I mean, what option do they have?
Well, it's just wrong.
I know. It's wrong, but...
So you have to find a way around that as a writer. You don't.
Oh, no, you do. You have to find a way around it.
Yeah.
Some reason they get lucky, but...
I wonder if there's a greater challenge to some extent with you've
Val can say, autumn came. Yeah.
you could have a leaf
Yeah.
drift, but I just mean that you have to tighten things and work to the medium of television, whereas it is, I presume, different on the page in that there's a bit more wriggle room to think, I've got space to expand this.
You find a way around it much more readily, because I don't have to do something visual. I can find a workaround that is still within the bounds of reality,
Yes.
which is much more difficult to do on the screen, because it's got to happen visually, and as you say, it's got to happen like now.
If there is something that takes a long time, your best bet is either to put it at the end of an episode, so you've got some kind of mysterious time gap, or set it running at the very, very start. Everybody forgets about it. Nobody could tell you precisely how many days have elapsed. Well, she's changed her clothes, but but not to draw too much attention to the fact that you're slightly obfuscating how long or short something
I
was.
thought you did that as the scriptwriter in Traces. I thought you did that really well, because there was a part in it where we were doing work on drug samples or something like that, and you were saying, okay, so how fast could we get this done? I said, it would take months. So it was started in like episode 1, and then by the time it got to episode 5, they had the eureka moment. But there was these little clips of these people working away on these samples, and I thought the way you wove that in was really true to how we would do that in the real world. One of the things that I thought was really excellent was one of the tweets, I think, that came out as that first series aired, which was about the science becoming one of the characters in the script, and I thought that was, that's what it's about.
There were things, there was I can't remember what it was a really good looking piece of equipment that was in the titles. It just looked amazing. It had yellow fluid in it. It was sort of bulbous and complicated, and nobody doing any of the science in the story ever would have used it, and it did look good, and we had to say, it can't be in there. It doesn't mean anything, and it's just we can't have gone to all this trouble to have this pointless, irrelevant thing so prominent in the titles, and it caused a bit of, everybody was annoyed.
That's the problem with bringing the scientist onto the set, who goes, "What's that supposed to be?"
But there are occasions when it's necessary to get the science wrong. Some years ago, I asked Niamh how I could blow up a small plane in 1994 with readily available chemicals over the counter. And we spent a lovely afternoon in your lab blowing things up.
Don't say that. We didn't.
Yes, that's
No,
absolutely
boss.
right. That's absolutely right.
No, we didn't go anywhere near a fume cupboard, and we didn't do anything with chemicals in a fume cupboard.
But actually, Niamh would tell me how to make a bomb.
Yeah.
Well, I mean,
But
do you know what I mean? Up to a point, she would. But then sometimes it would I'm not even going to tell you. So you don't even have to forget what I've told you. I'm going to, so the recipe was just a bit off. But
this recipe for blowing up, we eventually settled on the one that would work best. Yeah. And so when I came to write the book, I deliberately changed one of the ingredients. And because obviously I changed one of the ingredients. And when the book came out, within the first couple of weeks, we got about a dozen or more emails from, and I'm sorry about this, guys, but they were all from men, saying, "This would not blow up anything. This would not explode." And I'm like, well, duh.
We did have a question on that, actually. It was another one from Jim saying, is there a balance between realism in depicting the way crimes are committed and making sure that you don't give potential criminals a handy instruction booklet? And, I mean, that...
Of course there is.
Of course there is. Of course there is.
no, we worried about that.
We did.
Yeah.
And I would get notes back from people in the, the broadcast or the channel watching it saying, can you really? Haven't you just told people how to, whatever it was? But because Niamh had put kind of fault lines in it, you couldn't have followed through and done what we said.
Niamh, I mean, what extent does it tend to be the more complex or difficult science that falls victim to all this? I mean, are there particular, or is it just the less, I was going to say boring, I can't say boring, the less engaging areas of science that fall victim to this?
No science is boring.
No science is boring, which is why I didn't use that word.
Yeah, I'm being a good scientist. I think some of the technologies that we use are quite complicated. So the way in which we analyze for DNA, for example, or the way in which we analyze drugs or other types of materials can be quite complicated in terms of the machines that we use. But delivering the result can be relatively straightforward once we've got that technology working. I think the element that becomes very complicated in the real world is the interpretation of what that evidence means, particularly nowadays, because we have a lot more what we call complex DNA profiles or mixed DNA profiles that appear in casework. And that's where when we analyse, as forensic scientists analyse a DNA sample, we only look at very small little bits of your DNA. We don't look at the whole genome as we do in other areas now of medicine and science. And so we only look at these really small, limited number of places. A little bit like fingerprints, if you like. You've got 10 fingerprints and you've got 17 parts of your DNA that we look at. So again, if I go back to analogy, we've all been standing around these tables today, and other people I'm sure have been around them recently. And because our technology is so sophisticated now, we can take a swab of the table, and when we analyse it, we get, or could get, the DNA from certainly all four of us, and from the people who put down the water bottles and so on, all coming together in one mixed profile. And so our job becomes, if you imagine it, it's 10 people's sets of fingerprints sitting on top of each other. So our job now is to go, how do we unmix that and separate it out into Amelia's and mine and Val's and Penn's and other people's? And that's hard, because that becomes a mathematical problem. It's a difficult problem. And it's that complexity isn't, I think, shown on the screen, or it is in the books to a certain extent. But it's a very difficult thing to portray. But that's where it becomes really complicated for us. as the scientists then in the witness box trying to explain what I've just explained to members of the public who are the jury.
And this is why there's so much more historical crime fiction being written now. Setting novels before we had any of this stuff.
But in terms of the creative process, give us a sense of how it works. So do you come up with an idea and then start to kind of put out feelers to say, could this work? How is this going to work? I mean, I would imagine, is it evolving the whole time in a collaborative kind of way? How do you work when you're working with complex science in your books or on TV?
Well, it usually starts off with me deciding how I would like something to happen. And then speaking to the appropriate person, often Niamh, sometimes Sue, sometimes Lorna Dawson, the soil scientist, and saying, here's what I'm thinking about. Would this work? And then they'll say, no, don't be ridiculous. And so I'll say, well, how can we make something like this work? So we'll have a conversation around the subject. And generally speaking, we arrive at a point where I've got something that works in terms of the science, and Niamh's happy that it's not going to make her look like an idiot.
Or publish it before I do.
Oh, yes. I know. That's another story, yes. Oh, no. Yes, as Sue once said, you could have waited till I'd published the paper. But so it does evolve. But the other thing about it is that we have these conversations, and in the course of these conversations, I might say something like, what are you working on just now? Mm-hmm. And Niamh or Sue or whoever will tell me some fascinating little piece of information that I can then either use in that book or tuck away and use somewhere else. I remember having a conversation one time with Sue Black about tattoos. If you have a tattoo, the lymph nodes nearest to that tattoo will take up some of the dye that's in the tattoo. So if you have a red and blue tattoo on your arm, your lymph nodes will have red and blue ink in. So when you do the post-mortem, you can say, if say you find a torso, you can say, well, this torso had a tattoo on one arm, or it had a green and black tattoo on the left leg. And I thought that was fascinating. And of course, if you tattoo someone post-mortem to make them look like somebody else, they've not got the lymph nodes tattooed. So just this casual conversation in passing, I got a whole novella out of it.
What about for you, Amelia, in terms of the creative?
Well, with the second series of traces, so Val had sketched out the big bones of the story for the first series, and then we had a second series to write. We didn't have any story at all, but by then we knew what the fields of forensic science were. So it's very boring when you have, an episode ending with a dead body, and it happens because it's the perfect hook. So, Sarge, there's another body, but bombs are very good because bombs needn't kill anybody, but everybody is scared, particularly when they start to happen. It seems like it's a series. They build a lot of tension. They're mysterious because there can be lots of different kinds of bombs, so there's lots of different things for the scientists to interpret. And the other thing I was going to say about a key thing is explanation, because what Niamh was saying, there's very complicated things to explain, so you better be sure that you've got characters in your story who are inherently needing to learn. So it might be there's a police officer who doesn't get the science, or it might be you've got a nascent scientist who needs to know that stuff. But one of the things that really bugs me is not so much science, crude depicting of science, but when people tell each other stuff they know. So two scientists working in a lab, equally skilled, they don't need to explain anything. And they will be talking maybe in a sort of foreign language to an outsider. So that's fine as long as the person who naturally does need to be told that is the person who is told it. You can always find somebody who needs to be taught, but it does really drive me nuts when it was like when family members tell each other about mum dying and you think they knew that, or when scientists explain how a piece of equipment works that the other scientist's been working with for 20 years. You know, you just got to find a way around it because everybody smells a rat when that happens.
Let's go to another couple of questions here. This is from Ekram, and it's for Niamh. It says, among the crime fiction you've read so far, is there a particular field of forensic science that you think has been neglected and deserves some well-deserved attention?
Sharpen your pencil, you see. I think I would perhaps not so much say a field that's been neglected and deserves attention. So I'm going to slightly change your question. Sorry about that. I think the way in which, in particular, fire scene investigation has been depicted in books and in TV programs, the way in which we would analyse it is not depicted terribly well, which of course irritates quite a lot of fire scene investigators, because it's a really complicated area and you have to know an awful lot about an awful lot of things. But it's the systematic nature of how we do that piece of work, I think, isn't always depicted terribly well. And similarly, the way in which fires move and develop isn't particularly depicted terribly well, with some exceptions. So that's one area I think that's not done awfully well sometimes. I think in terms of areas that are neglected, gosh, you don't see very much about fibres, about how you analyse them, or about paint and glass, so that the really old traditional trace evidence types. And there's an awful lot to learn about those kind of materials. And I think, again, I'd go back to an area that's not depicted terribly well in terms of not the type of evidence, but the way in which how we understand how evidence transfers, and once it transfers, how it persists, isn't depicted well. And if it's such a cornerstone to our understanding.
I wonder if there's some extent to which having extremely skilled writers like Amelia and Val writing about forensic science actually, has the potential to communicate to a lay audience in a really effective way, which, I mean, I'm not saying that you don't communicate effectively. I know communication is a massive part of what you do, but actually flip it over and is a great advantage to be had of having writers write science in a way that they understand it, so long as they get it right.
I think, and I'll let my colleagues speak for themselves in a second, but both of them have experienced this. I think both Val and Amelia were trusting enough, I suppose, of me to allow me to bring them into my lab and show them that little tiny experiment that we did in the laboratory, that we did, that showed how the chemicals work. Or poor Amelia, I remember when we met one time here in London, and I showed you how to take a toaster apart and how you start to look at some of the area. Lucky Amelia. And that you're willing to go there and allow an expert to say, this is the guts of what we do. This is why if you do this device will go on fire, and and so on and so forth. And you experience it for yourselves, because I'm not a storyteller, both of you are. But I think you need to see it, experiencing it, the smell of it, the sound of it, the feel of it, and then you tell the story about it.
And those small things, if they're done really well, have a huge impact. There's one thing in the first series of Traces I still remember about the cardboard packaging being burnt, and because the barcode on the packaging has kaolin clay in it. That the label survives the fire because it's not combustible.
Well, the barcode is still just about readable, even though the whole label is charred. The barcode has burnt at a different rate from the white label because of this kaolin. The kaolin makes the paper smooth, fills in the micro textures, bumps, gaps of the paper. Anyway, yeah, things like that.
Those are the things that make you go, wow.
Yeah.
Genuinely, you think, that's amazing. You set fire to something, you think you've burnt the evidence, but you haven't. You've actually made the evidence almost more obvious. And so it's moments like that. So you show us these things and we understand them and we get excited. And hopefully we commit that, we communicate that excitement to the reader or the viewer.
Let me come to another question. This is from David Ballard. David says, how important do you feel it is to get the ethics correct about what forensic tests are done? Thinking especially about some applications of forensic DNA that have been used in fiction, e.g. that someone has a rare disease that couldn't be carried out in reality because of ethical restrictions.
I can't answer that one. That's
So it's a really important question, and we're coming into an age where the issues around use of people's data that we publicly give sometimes, or that data that's supplied because you want to trace your ancestry or whatever it might be, the use of that data then for a purpose that you didn't agree to, even if that purpose is a criminal investigation, is a really thorny, complicated issue that we're beginning to explore, and rightly so, across how law enforcement or how the criminal justice system in different countries might deal with that. And it's different in different countries. In the UK here, we are very, very mindful of the ethical implications of using what I would call data that's not being consented for a particular use. So it's a subject of much debate. It's a good question.
And I think at the moment they're actually talking about putting all the photographs from passports into a database and all other general sources of facial imagery into one searchable database, so that the police can input a CCTV image and a press of a button.
But the importance is they're talking about it.
No, this is a plan. This is in the lifetime of this Parliament.
But it's one thing to talk about doing it, it's another thing to make it actually happen, because there are a lot of checks and balances around ethics around that.
You think those are going to be put in play with this government?
I'm going to say, trust me.
I trust you. You're a doctor.
I wonder if, what's really evident in both Val and Amelia is your kind of excitement for the science that you're coming across. And I wonder the extent to which maybe, Amelia, you feel that as a wordsmith, you've actually got a role in bringing that excitement to a new audience. You're getting excited about stuff, you know what feels sparky, which may be different stuff to what Niamh gets excited about, but you're bringing that to a lay audience. Do you see that as an important role?
I think it was important to get nerdy about what could be really exciting about something quite small, so that it'd be kind of to really get across to my bosses that this little thing that would look really beautiful, or that really would be a moment, but because there was some teaching, so I had to get taught, and then I had to encourage or persuade or convince people that was going to be good. And that's about teaching, like re-educating the expectation of what might be a thrill. But the easy thing there is that when you've got because all the scientists in Traces, like all the scientists I had met, absolutely loved their job. So that's a great thing to watch. Somebody who loves doing what they do and is very good at it is great to watch. So their approach towards an excitement for what they were doing, that's what really sells it. Because if that character is so fired up about what's happened on that bit of blotting paper or that fragment of charcoal or whatever, then we can be. So
actually, one of the things that I get annoyed about in television and in books is when you've got a character who's a pathologist or some other kind of scientist who's just like, oh, I'm really bored, I hate this job, I don't know why I'm doing this, I really hate it, I can't be bothered with it. Because that, as you say, is just contrary to everybody I've ever encountered in this field who have that passion. And for me, as a writer of novels, I don't have to persuade anybody else, thankfully, that this little bit of tech is really exciting. I can just write it in such a way that, I hope I can just write it in such a way that makes it exciting. As long as the science is there, I can do the other stuff, which is less easy for you to do on screen.
How much is there a kind of feedback loop? I mean, do you take your work back to experts like Niamh and get them to read over it and check the science?
Not really.
Because you've explained it to me. I
Yeah,
understand it. It's fine. I think.
But what does happen occasionally
Stupid.
when I've read Val's books is I'm reading along, so I'm enjoying this. I'm going, oh, and there's this character appears who happens to be a professor of fire investigation. You're thinking, oh, or forensic anthropology. It's not just one of us. And you read along and you think, oh, who happens to be Irish, and you think, hold on a minute. And so on the front, bam. So yes, so there's interesting things like that appear in the books, which is a quid pro quo, and you're very kind, but nonetheless.
Is it ever a case, I mean, maybe it isn't, but I know you have to communicate this stuff all the time. You have to communicate it in court, but also to all the audiences that you go and talk to, and lots of lay audiences. Do you ever learn anything about how to communicate science from the work of guys like these?
I think the one of the things that we've learned over the years, and in part of the work that we do at the Leverhulme Centre in Dundee, is there's a really great power in narrative. I mean, Amelia and Val are huge testaments to that. There's a power in telling a story, in putting the information into a context that people can relate to and can understand. So rather than explaining the complexity of how a machine works, if we can make an analogy of what the machine is actually achieving through something that you can visualize and you can understand, then that enables the scientists to communicate the complexities of what we have to do. And so learning or explaining things through putting it into a narrative context is something that certainly comes out from both film and the page.
And we did the online course for lay people to follow, which I wrote the bare narrative for, and you guys filled in the clever bits. But that was working hand in hand, week by week. People were learning at home from the online course that we developed between us.
Yeah.
I did get my work checked by Niamh because there was no point in having done all that preliminary stuff to not have it right in the final scene. So I would send Niamh the scenes I'd written to make sure that sometimes you just needed to change the wording of something, or sometimes I remember once Niamh had done me a sketch of the fire chain, how fire starts. So she'd sketched it out with a pen, and I'd slavishly copied it down, and then I'd written it in the script, and then I'd sent a drawing to the art department, and they'd made this same thing to go on the whiteboard, and Laura Fraser was going to write it up, and Niamh said to me, "What are those little triangles?" I said, "Those little triangles, they're the little triangles that you did the little triangles, and then I did the little triangles, and now she's doing it." She said that they were flames. She was just, so something as simple as that. So if that hadn't been checked, that bogus, like the recipe for fire involving triangles would have been, it would have been a disaster, international disaster.
Lesson to learn, I can't draw.
But I think one of the things that's very important to me when I'm talking to you guys is that trying to, over the years, finding scientists who can communicate not just the terms of the science, but who can communicate it in terms that I can drop into my text, so that someone who's reading it immediately gets it in the way that I've got it when you told it to me. It's that great line of yours, it's when a fire in a room becomes a room on fire. And images like, on occasion,
You've had that, I've had that.
we've had that. We've all had that.
Yeah.
Yeah, we've all seen the video of the Christmas tree, sort of those moments are wonderful. And I remember once speaking to Sue Black and asking what a pubic scalp would look like in formaldehyde, and she said, "Tin tuna." And I couldn't eat tuna for months after that. Shocking.
I've been taking these questions off Slido, but is anyone wanting to kind of ask in the old-fashioned way by putting a hand up and waving? I'm Yes. Have we got a mic to get to gentleman at the front here? Just rush round. Hi.
Thank you. Many years ago, I used to write for The Bill, where the storylines were much more simpler, and we didn't have to worry about forensics and stuff like that. I think the problem is nowadays that with the pressure on the viewer, who can switch off, has so many more choices on streaming and such like that, that it would be difficult to show sometimes the detail of the forensics because you might lose the viewer. And I think that as long as you get the spirit of the forensics okay in the programme, I think most viewers would accept that. So I accept that, to get a DNA analysis takes a long time for those results to come back. But you can't show that, as we discussed earlier, in such a programme because you'll just lose the viewer. But I think if you show the spirit of that and say that, well, it was a match, I think that's acceptable, really. But I accept that it would be nice, even if you're showing the spirit of it, to get it correct, at least you should do that.
Yeah, I'm starting to twitch now, you see.
The problem is you then create expectations, as Niamh said right at the beginning, with a jury, who will then go like, well, why are we not getting this information, and why are we getting that information? And they've come to expect something different from what's presented to them. There's now an expectation often within the jury room that they're going to get DNA. Even if there's 3 other different kinds of identifier, if they're on CCTV, if we've got a fingerprint from them, and if we've got a footprint matching their shoes, and the jury going, well, where's the DNA?
And that's reality. That happens. Colleagues of mine who present cases, who work in the legal services, who present cases by starting the case by telling the jury why there isn't DNA, because otherwise the jury feel the case is weaker. And it's not. It's just the DNA is not appropriate. But I take what you said. I mean, it's all about what we're trying to achieve in these different genres. If I consider forensic science a genre, which I probably shouldn't, and that is that the work of television and books is to entertain people, and is to keep them on that hook, as you said. But what we would plead is that and you said it yourself, is that the science is depicted in a way that's accurate.
I think if the story, if in the crime story the forensic science is kind of peripheral and reported, but you're mostly with the detective work, that's one thing. But if you're promising that the forensic science is going to be front and centre, then you had better really get it right and invite the audience to take time, get fascinated, to come in rather than look at their watch or make a cup of tea. So that's the challenge. But for some dramas, somebody comes in with a piece of forensic science news and you don't really think about it because that's not where the focus of the story is. But when it is the focus, then I think spirit isn't quite enough. I think spirit you can get away with if it's round the edges, but not if you put it in the middle, I think.
I think there's a potential, isn't there, for great power here, because there is such an appetite for crime fiction, whether it's TV, podcasts, on the page, in books, and so there's a great opportunity potentially here in communicating science. Leslie was asking on Slido why you think people are so fascinated about crime fiction or shows, and does it mean that more people are wanting to become forensic scientists? Are you having a rush?
Everybody likes to solve a murder, don't they? Everybody's fascinated by it, and it's not a new thing. You know, Sherlock Holmes, Edgar Allan Poe, other writers that go back. Yeah, you know, and so there's that. I think yes, there's a lot of interest in young people in entering into this profession, and my advice to them is get yourself a really good science degree first that teaches you science, because we can bolt on the application, which is the forensic application of it, or the application of how we do the analysis that we do. But unless you're a scientist first, that's what we need, is scientists. So yes, it attracts people into the profession, but the way to get into the profession is do good, solid science degrees.
I don't know if you come up with this off the top of your head, but I wonder, for Amelia and Val, what have been the most difficult pieces you felt you had to kind of right in terms of the science? Have you ever felt stuck or fenced in by the science?
I think I've always sometimes I've had an idea about how to do something, and then I've spoken to some of the scientists, and they've said, no, it's just not going to work. But because you guys are always very generous with your time and your expertise, you've said, here's what you could do that would have a similar response to what you're trying to get. I find sometimes the forensic anthropology stuff quite hard, because it's very human. It's about who we are, about our identity, our biological identity, our physical identity, and some of that I find quite it can be quite emotionally upsetting in the way that the different sciences are not necessarily, they don't have that kind of visceral feel. You know, when you're taking a body from a situation where it's been for varying lengths of time, and reading that body.
Got a question in the middle there. We better rush round some questions here because we're running out of time, aren't we?
Thank you.
Hi.
What do you wish, or what do you think will be available for forensic science in 10, 20 years?
Oh my. We've just had a really good 2-day meeting here at the Royal Society where we were discussing just that with colleagues in the judiciary. And what's the future going to bring? I think we're at a point in time where it's actually quite hard to predict that now. One of the things that's rushing at us is the way in which we're now all digitally connected. So we have to get our act together around digital evidence and understand better how we might make use of it. Because our entire society is now run by it to a large extent. With the Internet of Things, it connects everything to everything, or will do at some point. And it's changing really fast. The implementation of tools like machine learning, how do we bring those in a safe way, in a way that's not just interesting for the science, but acceptable to the courts, because it's that relationship that becomes the critical thing. Just because we do the science does not necessarily mean that it's the right level for being admissible into our court proceedings. So there's those kind of things. There's lots of seductive technology out there that's coming down the tracks at us, and we have to pick the bits of it that will work for the justice system, which is not necessarily all of it. So it's going to be an interesting time over the next number of years, which is a very roundabout way of saying I actually don't know what's going to be like in 10 years' time.
We've probably got time to squeeze in one more quick question. There was someone at the next to you there.
In the context of DNA transfer, which you spoke to at the beginning, in TV shows you often see people wiping down the murder weapon or wiping down the gun. Does that work?
That's a really good question. It's very good at getting rid of fingerprints, but if you're handling the piece of cloth that you're using to wipe down the weapon, what we couldn't say is that the DNA you've put on the piece of cloth doesn't remain on the piece of cloth, or that you're not transferring actually more of your DNA onto it as you're wiping it down. So the answer to that is we don't know, because we've not done the research to address it. And those are the gaps yet, and those are the gaps. So,
the more we find out, the more there is to find out.
yeah.
I think that brings us quite neatly to a close. That is it for this evening's discussion. There are still events happening this evening here at the Royal Society, so do keep exploring the wide range of things on offer. Thank you all for your questions and your contributions, both online and here in the room. A special thanks to the Royal Society here in London for putting this together, and of course to our panel, Niamh Nic Daeid, Val McDermid and Amelia Bullmore. Thank you.